Chapter 3. London looked as grey as usual, with the familiar sounds of inconsiderate people's dogs barking, people's voices all mixing in a song of random words, the honking of impatient drivers, the acceleration of also said drivers, the screeching of others who clearly needed new brake pads, and the forever echo of seagulls and crows fighting over territory, not to mention the little old man who feeds them. London was in a state of normality. Fred's eyes drifted from one angle to the next. He was laying on the bed, half clothed and half covered in a duvet. He was just waiting out time. It was too early to get ready, and was too late to go back to sleep. His flight to Japan was at 10 this morning. His luggage was already packed. Everything apart from himself was ready. Watching the digital clock change from 5:52 to 5:53, his eyes drifted across the room once more. Fred's bedroom wasn't very big, and had a window 3/4 his size. Shining through was a soft light from the remnants of the moon. Getting up and slowly walking to the window, he looked out and up, waiting for the grey clouds to shift. He wanted to see it one more time before he left. As the clouds moved away and the light from the moon broke free, he heard a woman's voice, gentle, quiet, but somewhat violent, as it stung the ear canal and lingered like something trapped. Fred woke up to the buzzing and screaming of his alarm on his phone. A dream, he thought to himself. Looking at the time, it was 6 in the morning. Turning 6:01, Fred got up and got ready. Checking his luggage at the door, he turned back and walked to his bedroom window. Looking up, he saw it, faint and small, but there it was, the moon. By the time Fred got himself and his stuff down the stairs, he was surprised to see Rita waiting outside for him, with the others in tow. Giving a small wave and a large puff at putting his luggage in the back of the van, they all set off to London Gatwick Airport. Fred found himself in a state of empty thought, neither having nothing on the mind, but lost in the visuals out of his passenger side window. Amongst the chatting at the back, no one really noticed the lack of Fred's engagement in the chatting. Rita, however, did throw over some looks of curiosity and wonder. After a small while, Rita did ask Fred if he was okay, to which he replied, "I'm fine, thanks." Fred could feel this tingling cold unease in the pit of his stomach. He felt something was coming like a sixth sense, but he didn't know what it was. Watching the earth blur by him at 73 miles per hour, he knew he had to be ready. How he was going to be ready for something he had no idea about threw him off completely. So he simply ignored his body and forced himself into group discussions about what food to try or what alcohols to drink. The airport was as lively as it always has been. Children being scolded, people sleeping, arguments over mobile phones, toilet cleaners with expressions of mild depression, and airport staff putting on a happy voice over the announcements, of which there were many. A lot of flights had been cancelled due to emergency runway maintenance. This did not affect Fred and his party travelling to Japan. In fact, it made their flight leave earlier than expected. They were on the plane at least an hour early, with just over half the people missing. The cabin crew seemed to just sit everyone available, then began procedures, explaining that any missing passengers will get their flight rebooked at a later time. The atmosphere on the plane was calm, but "There's always one," Rita said with disappointment. Fred looked over to see a woman arguing with the flight attendant. It seemed that the woman's husband was joining from a connecting flight, and rightly so, was not happy with the flight leaving without him. The attendant was trying her best to calm the woman, but to no avail. Fred, without thinking, went over to the confrontation, and the flight attendant held her hand out as if to say stop, or please don't get involved. Fred silently gave a short smile to the flight attendant, and winked quickly before facing the angry woman. The angry woman was 1 foot or so shorter than Fred, so the anger in her eyes were the dominant denominator. Gently, Fred raised his arms in a grabbing gesture.
"Don't you touch me!"
shouted the woman in a screeching voice. Fred ignored her. "Hello, I'm a passenger. I'm sitting over there." Fred pointed at Rita, who looked rather confused.
"So what do you want from me?"
the woman shouted once more. "I can see that you love and value being with your husband. I can see people don't understand that," Fred said with a small smile and sad eyes. The woman's eyes lowered, and the height of her anger began to drop. "I don't want to leave my husband," she said in a loud but sad voice. "Grab the next flight with him. If I had someone that loved me like you love your husband, I would want my wife to wait for me. Sounds selfish though, I guess," Fred said, lowering his hands. The woman's expression lowered. Her eyes searched Fred with an empathetic tone. She then sighed and turned to the attendant. "I just want to be with my husband," she said sadly. The flight attendant nodded silently in agreement, then said, "We will book you in with your husband on the next flight. It will be a 2-hour wait at most." The woman fell silent for a moment, as if in contemplation, and then, "Okay," she said. The flight attendant slowly placed an arm around the woman to guide her out of the plane. Looking back, she said thank you silently with her lips. Fred nodded in acknowledgement and began to turn back to go to his seat. As he took a step, he heard the woman's voice. "Someday," she said. Fred turned to her and gave her a blank look. She smiled at him and then began again with the flight attendant to leave the plane. "Flights to Japan and now de-escalating angry women? You're full of surprises lately. You eating that cereal everyone's talking about or something?" Fred didn't answer with words. He decided a small tilt with the head to the side and a wink with a smile would do the trick. Rita rolled her eyes, to which everyone was seated, and the plane lifted off. The flight was a long one. Fred had travelled before, but not for such a long journey. Sharing the toilet on the plane was more pleasant, since there wasn't as many people as usual. A flight, however, would not be a flight without children running up and down the aisle or crying in or around the area. "Thank God for headphones," Rita said loud enough for others to hear. Some smiled and others frowned in response. Getting off the plane, Fred felt an excitement looking through the airport windows. He searched the sky with his eyes, almost bumping into a large column. "Did you drink on that plane?" Rita asked. "No," Just noticed the clouds form a little differently here, Fred remarked. Well, you can look after we get out of this maze. Last thing we need is you in hospital or in prison for bumping into someone, Rita retorted. Fred knew Rita didn't like airports. He could see it in her body language and expressions. The crumpled nose, the raised but yet angry eyebrows, twitching like blinking, the slip of her spectacles due to anxiety sweat on the nose, very common itching on the crown of her hair, and finally, a obsessive check on her wristwatch. Sorry, Rita, Fred said, covering his bottom lip with his top. For what? Rita replied, with no intention of sounding angry, but it just came out that way. The airports, Fred confessed. You can tell. Do you think the others can tell? Rita pampered her hair as if to change something. If they can't tell, you hired the wrong people, Fred answered, giving a casual look at the others in the group, to which none offered eye contact. I suppose you're right. I'll be fine after a coffee, I think, said Rita, pulling on her jacket, correcting small creases towards the upper section. The rolling of suitcase wheels and distant chatter became the song for the rest of their time in the airport. Fred kept an eye on Rita and her stress levels, using the rest of his energy keeping him awake. He kept the group's optimism high, with short jokes and interesting pointings at things he had never seen before. Exiting the airport, a shuttle bus was waiting for them in good time. It was an unusually curvy shuttle bus, with rounded corners and large Japanese kanji printed almost everywhere. The last but obnoxious thing standing out was a rather happy Japanese man, printed on the side with a wide open mouth and little teeth characters in and out of his mouth in what seemed to be like an advert for a dental agency. Among the people of the bus, there were people from what seemed to be a lot of different countries, America, Europe, and even Eastern Asia. The driver spoke quite broken English, but it was understandable. He was a rather short man in comparison to Fred. He had a full head of hair and quite a few wrinkles. His hands were stained a faded yellow, and his teeth were quite wonky and discoloured. His eyes, however, held what seemed to be a mix of resentment and happiness, perhaps due to customers and his love for driving. Oh my, could this man drive! He took them through snake roads, through a large mountain pass, and skillfully remained at high speed. Rita was not very fond of the man's driving skills, but the majority held high praise for his driving. It wasn't long before they arrived to their hidden resort in Hokkaido. The sky was a little shade of blue, with subtle touches of white brush taps of the clouds. A light mist of white steam was drifting from the sauna room of the building. Its large structure was very square and oblong obsessed. Surrounding the building was nothing but trees and shrubbery. The place looked isolated. However, it was uphill from a small little town where the moon celebration would be held. Fred, this might be your best idea yet, said Rita, quite satisfied with a glance. Agreed, said the others in the group. Fred had never been to Japan. He didn't know what to expect. It was more along the thought of accepting any inconvenience that come his way through cultural differences. However, the Japanese people were far more considerate than Fred had given them credit for, but holding on their own traditions, they kept tourists or foreigners at arm's length, as they could discern their intent or motives through body language alone. Walking into the square oblong building, they were encouraged to take off their shoes by a petite Japanese woman wearing a yukata made of material described as silk, but could have been something entirely different. The sakura petals that flew through the wind outside looked like they had landed on a Japanese lady's yukata, and just stayed there. But it was just that good of embroidery that everyone in the group admired it as something they had never seen before. The woman smiled in acknowledgement of their admiration, and a tint of red hit her cheeks. Shoes off and slippers on, they were swept off their feet by a young Japanese man who gracefully took all their luggage and placing it on a cart, vanishing before they could turn away to go to reception. The room itself, as well as any pathway in the building, was made of wood. This wood was so shiny it would make you blink twice. The building was made of pathways of narrow corridors that left open square garden-like places where there were benches, plants, and a small pond of catfish with rare variations of colour patterns adorning their backs. Even Fred found himself saying out loud that this place was amazing. A few minutes of slow walking, and they arrived at their rooms. Fred had been the odd one out, so got a room alone, but deep down he wanted it that way. Self-reflection at night alone was something he enjoyed, and even better, he wasn't in London anymore, but was in this beautiful place. It was getting late, and Fred had just got ready for bed, before a gentle knock on his wooden sliding door took his attention. "Yes?" asked Fred. "It's Rita. Can I come in?" Rita asked. "Depends. You're not drunk, are you?" Fred asked sarcastically. "You wish," Rita retorted. Fred opened the small silver lock on the wooden sliding door, and opened it to find Rita wearing a dressing gown. "I hope there are clothes under that robe," Fred said sarcastically. Rita opened the robe to reveal her pyjamas, entirely covered with fruit-like characters wearing sunglasses. "I don't know what's worse," Fred said, smiling. Rita hit him with her dressing gown, and they went to the small table near the sliding glass doors that led to a small square garden. After sitting down and taking a few minutes to get comfortable, Rita finally asked, "Are you okay?" Fred looked surprised. "What do you mean?" he asked. "You seem like different. Has something happened?" Rita asked with a genuine expression of concern. Fred felt himself lying before the words would reach his tongue. He saw his expression in the small time of a blink, his lowered gaze, his controlled but directed words, the uncomfortable itch surrounding his forearm, and the rising temperature from his chest. "I think I'm having a midlife crisis," said Fred, casually, with palms up in the air. "I knew it, but why can't you just be like every other guy and buy a two-seater sports car?" Rita said, with a hint of sarcasm. There was a moment where they looked at each other in the eye with a pause of silence. There was a moment where words could no longer translate the feeling. A feeling that was neither fleeting nor stubborn, but a feeling that just needed understanding without a translation. "I think I get it," Rita said suddenly. "You do?" Fred asked, surprised. "Yeah, this is basically your menopause moment. So be it a dramatic one. But it's okay. Just support me when I get there, alright?" said Rita, with a wink, and just like that, she got up and left the room. Her expression hidden from Fred, she showed concern and thought that confined itself to confusion. Fred was relieved that the conversation and the subject was over. There was something comforting about the unwelcome silence that followed. Eyes drawn to the night sky, Fred found himself searching the sky. With silence on his lips, the environment bellowed in cricketing and the buzzing of wings with the occasional ribbit from a frog. The sky, taking the blunt stare of Fred's eyes, showed no reaction. It held firm in its dark and omnipresent figure, offering Fred's eyes dots of light from distant stars, and the occasional drifting cloud oblivious to the human emotion. It was then that Fred felt the welling in his stomach, the foundation of the feeling one would feel before crying. It crawled along his limbs and down his spine, making him shiver in return. This feeling gripped his toes and fingers, causing him to clench them into the tatami mats and the wooden frame of the sliding glass door. Am I going to pass out? Fred wondered. His head tilted towards the night sky once more, and in under a blink he saw it take over the sky. The moon. Its shining light taking over the night sky, it appeared as strong as the sun. Every crevice, canyon, and speck on the moon visible and naked for Fred to see with his eyes widened, and the retinas became white with visible information. His heart pacing in 3 directions, to beats unyielding of booms. His senses as if all at once disappeared, and in a blanket of white light, Fred lost himself. Wiping his eyes of the blazing white light, he found himself in a room made entirely of what seemed to be wood, but it shimmered like a snake. Slowly, silently, it hypnotized him, and once again, Fred found himself in eyes of white.